My name is Nina. I am 38 years old. I wish you were never born. My parents looked me dead in the eye and said those exact words on my own birthday. Then they turned to the daughter they were actually proud of and declared to the room, "This family only has one daughter, and that is Linda." She smirked at me, a victorious smile spreading across her face. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply disappeared. 10 years later, those same people tracked me down sobbing and begging me to save them from a federal prison sentence. I looked at them with the exact same cold calmness they had shown me a decade ago. Before I open up the ledger and show you exactly how a family's lies finally caught up to them, please take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you know what it feels like to be backed into a corner by your own blood. Drop a comment right now telling me what city you are watching from and what time it is. The story I am about to tell you has a twist nobody saw coming. Today, I sit in a corner office on the top floor of a financial firm. I am a senior auditor. I chose this profession for one very specific reason. I grew up in a house where every word spoken was an unpaid debt. I am obsessed with numbers because numbers do not know how to lie, but my parents certainly did. To understand how they ended up facing a decade behind bars and why I held the ultimate key to their salvation, I need to take you back to where the rot first started. Let's rewind to the snow-covered valley of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, long before the wealthy facade of our family shattered. The supreme arrogance my sister carried did not materialize out of thin air. It was meticulously cultivated over decades within the towering cedarwood walls of our Jackson Hole estate. My mother, Evelyn Sterling, treated her life like an endless editorial spread. Her days were consumed by charity galas, exclusive country club luncheons, and maintaining an exhausting illusion of generational wealth. She swiped platinum credit cards with a practiced flick of the wrist, completely blind to the reality crumbling beneath her designer heels. Meanwhile, my father, Richard Sterling, was the grand architect of this localized theater. He spent his afternoons on pristine golf courses, loudly boasting to anyone who would listen about the booming success of his luxury real estate brokerage. He projected the image of an untouchable titan of industry. However, an auditor's brain is permanently wired to detect discrepancies. I spent my professional hours dissecting corporate balance sheets, hunting for hidden liabilities. It did not take long for that same analytical gaze to recognize the glaring anomalies inside my own childhood home. The math simply did not add up. I started noticing the subtle red flags: high-interest collection notices hastily shoved into the bottom of the mail basket, hushed and panicked phone calls taken behind locked mahogany doors, and a sudden, inexplicable shift in which banking institutions my parents utilized. They were bleeding cash yet accelerating their spending to prevent the local high society from smelling blood in the water. The urge to uncover the truth became undeniable. One evening, while Richard and Evelyn were attending a winter solstice banquet, I walked into my father's home office. The room smelled of expensive scotch and desperation. His desktop computer was left in sleep mode, a careless mistake by a man who believed his absolute authority made him immune to scrutiny. Bypassing the basic password protection took less than a minute. What I found waiting on that hard drive was not just a failing business model. It was a sprawling, multi-tiered financial crime. Opening the master accounting files, the brutal reality of the Sterling Empire stared back at me. The brokerage was entirely insolvent. In fact, it had effectively gone bankrupt 24 months prior. Instead of filing for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection and liquidating assets legally, Richard had chosen to double down on deception. He was systematically cooking the corporate books. I scrolled through dozens of falsified tax returns prepared for the Internal Revenue Service phantom revenue streams created out of thin air and the illegal commingling of client escrow funds to pay off personal mortgages. It was a massive tax fraud scheme, a fragile house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind from a federal investigator. My chest tightened, but panic did not take over. A lesser person might have printed the document, stormed into the banquet, and demanded answers. I knew better. Confronting narcissists with nothing left to lose would only result in gaslighting and the immediate destruction of the evidence. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a personal military-grade encrypted external hard drive. In absolute silence, I initiated a mass transfer. I dragged every fraudulent ledger, every forged bank statement, and every incriminating IRS form into my secure folder. I knew their crippling fear of public humiliation. These digital files were no longer just spreadsheets. They were my impenetrable shield. The progress bar on the screen finally hit 100%. I safely ejected the drive, slipping the cold metal into my coat pocket. Just as the monitor went dark, the heavy oak front door downstairs swung open, accompanied by a piercing, excited squeal. Peering over the upstairs banister, I saw Linda standing in the foyer, waving a massive diamond ring in the air. The blinding sparkle of that oversized diamond was the catalyst for the ultimate betrayal. Greg, my sister's new fiancé, was a classic opportunist who had been completely blinded by the Cedarwood mansion and the designer labels. He believed he was marrying into a dynasty, and my parents were absolutely terrified of shattering that illusion. A high-society Jackson Hole wedding demanded a massive influx of liquid cash, something the insolvent Sterling estate simply did not possess. In their desperate scramble to fund a fairy tale they could not afford, Richard and Evelyn crossed the final boundary separating moral bankruptcy from a federal felony. The realization hit me during a mundane Tuesday morning coffee break at my accounting firm. A seemingly innocuous automated email popped up on my phone. It was a standard alert from a major national credit bureau notifying me of a hard inquiry on my credit report. My initial thought was a simple administrative error. I logged into my secure financial dashboard to investigate. The screen loaded and the blood instantly drained from my face. A commercial bank had just initiated a comprehensive review for a high-yield six-figure personal loan. The primary applicant listed on the digital paperwork was Nina Sterling. I dug deeper, utilizing my professional access to trace the digital footprint of the application. The horrifying truth unraveled with every click. My parents had weaponized my identity. They possessed my social security number from old childhood tax documents, but they had gone several steps further to bypass modern security measures. They fabricated an entirely fake employment verification document using a manipulated letterhead from my current firm and executed a forged electronic signature to clear the initial online screening. If this fraudulent loan received final underwriter approval, I would be legally bound to a mountain of debt. Worse, given Richard's ongoing corporate tax evasion, having my name tied to his fabricated financial statements would make me a prime suspect for criminal conspiracy. They were actively framing their own daughter to pay for a wedding reception. There was no time for tears or dramatic family confrontations. I operated with the clinical precision of an auditor securing a compromised asset. Grabbing my coat, I left the office and drove straight to the main branch of the lending institution. I bypassed the standard teller line and demanded an immediate closed-door meeting with the branch manager. Sitting across from him, I laid out my state-issued identification, my genuine pay stubs, and a freshly drafted legal affidavit. In a calm, unwavering voice, I filed a formal identity theft complaint. I instructed the institution to flag the application as fraudulent, implement a hard freeze on my social security number, and halt all processing immediately. The manager, visibly pale upon realizing the severity of the wire fraud, reached for his desk phone to notify the applicants. I stopped him. I requested a strictly enforced communication blackout. The bank was not to send any rejection notices, cancellation letters, or automated text alerts to the contact information associated with the fake application until Monday morning. I needed a tactical advantage, a brief window of absolute silence to control the upcoming narrative. The manager stamped the cancellation protocol and handed me the physical confirmation receipt. I folded the crisp, watermarked paper, slipped it securely into my leather briefcase, and walked out into the biting mountain air. The fraudulent debt was neutralized. All that remained was to attend the lavish birthday dinner my father had so carefully orchestrated for Saturday evening, armed with the exact weapon he had unknowingly handed me. The exclusive lakeside VIP seafood restaurant was booked solid, though the lavish private dining room was certainly not reserved to celebrate my 28th birthday. The extravagant ice sculptures and imported champagne were carefully curated props for the evening's true objective, impressing Greg's affluent parents and finalizing the financial trap. I sat quietly at the edge of the mahogany table watching the psychological performance unfold. As the final gourmet courses were cleared away, Richard stood up, tapping a silver fork against his crystal flute. The room fell silent. He delivered a masterful, heartwarming speech about family bonds and Linda's upcoming nuptials. Then, with the practiced charm of a veteran salesman closing a deal, he reached into his tailored suit jacket and produced a thick stack of legal documents. He slid the pristine paperwork across the white linen tablecloth, stopping exactly in front of my plate. He handed me a gold-plated pen, his smile beaming for the audience, while his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, commanding threat. "A minor formality," he announced loudly. "Nina has generously offered to sign as the primary guarantor for a new family trust to fund her sister's destination wedding." The trap was elegantly sprung. He was banking entirely on my lifelong fear of causing a public scene to force my compliance. Greg's parents smiled approvingly, waiting for me to act the part. Instead, I calmly set the gold pen down. I picked up the loan agreement, glanced at the predatory terms, and firmly pushed the stack back across the table. "I won't be signing this," I stated, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the sudden tense quiet of the room. Richard's forced smile faltered instantly. Before he could interject, I pulled the bank manager's official cancellation receipt from my purse and placed it squarely on top of his documents. "I also took the liberty of visiting the main branch this morning to freeze the initial application you submitted, using my forged electronic signature. The lending institution's fraud department is already reviewing the identity theft complaint I filed." The color completely drained from Evelyn's face. Greg's father lowered his wineglass, his expression rapidly shifting to sharp, calculating concern. "Furthermore," I continued, keeping my tone as clinical as a corporate board meeting, "considering the absolute insolvency of your real estate brokerage and the highly irregular tax reporting over the last 2 fiscal years, taking on massive new commercial debt seems incredibly reckless." The silence that followed was utterly suffocating. The polished mask of the successful patriarch shattered entirely. Humiliated and legally exposed in front of his wealthy future in-laws, Richard lost all cognitive control. He slammed both hands onto the table, violently rattling the expensive silverware. His face flushed a dark crimson as he glared at me. "I wish you were never born." He snarled, the absolute venom in his voice, stripping away decades of aristocratic pretense. Evelyn immediately rushed to his side, throwing her arms around Linda, who had instinctively started producing dramatic fake sobs. My mother glared at me with pure hatred and declared to the stunned room, "This family only has one daughter, and that is Linda." Linda peered over our mother's shoulder, a victorious smirk cutting clearly through her theatrical tears. I looked at the three of them, permanently bound together by their shared deceit, and felt an unexpected wave of profound liberation. The heavy chain of obligation I had carried for years simply evaporated. Without another word, I picked up my coat, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to drown in the chaotic wreckage they had built. The harsh glare of the streetlights flickered rhythmically across my windshield as I drove out of the valley that very night, the heavy, encrypted hard drive resting safely on the passenger seat. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was leaving behind. The following Monday morning, operating from a transient hotel room miles away from Wyoming, I executed the final phase of my calculated exit. I compiled a meticulously organized digital dossier containing every forged electronic signature, the falsified bank applications, and the extensive evidence of corporate tax evasion. I dispatched this anonymous package directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the local field office of the FBI. The collapse of the Sterling Empire did not happen through a dramatic shouting match. It was executed with the quiet, devastating efficiency of the American federal justice system. The authorities moved swiftly. Within weeks, IRS agents descended upon the luxury real estate brokerage, seizing servers and freezing all associated corporate accounts under suspicion of severe wire fraud and tax manipulation. Without access to their illicitly managed funds, the facade disintegrated instantly. The commercial bank, already alerted to the identity theft surrounding the wedding loan, triggered an aggressive internal audit of Richard's existing mortgages. They discovered the massive insolvency I had seen months prior. The bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on the Cedarwood mansion. Evelyn's platinum credit cards were declined at the country club, her social standing evaporating the moment the rumors of a federal indictment hit the local elite circles. The most poetic justice, however, came from the opportunistic fiancé. Greg had always been a predator seeking a wealthy host. The moment he realized his future father-in-law was facing a potential decade in a federal penitentiary and that the family trust was a complete fabrication, he vanished. He abruptly canceled the lavish destination wedding, packed his belongings, and severed all ties with Linda, leaving her humiliated and drowning in the non-refundable deposits she had carelessly charged to her own maxed-out credit accounts. I did not orchestrate their ruin out of petty revenge. I simply handed the unvarnished truth over to the authorities and let the consequences of their own financial crimes devour them. They had built a life on deceit, and the law had finally come to collect the debt. While Richard and Evelyn were trapped in a labyrinth of legal defenses, desperately trying to avoid prison time during endless bankruptcy hearings, I was already rebuilding. I crossed the country, settling on the East Coast to establish a new identity far removed from the toxicity of Jackson Hole. I changed my phone number, severed all digital connections, and threw myself entirely into my career as a financial executive. The years began to pass quiet and incredibly successful. I assumed the chaotic chapter of my blood relatives was permanently closed, buried beneath a mountain of federal litigation. I was wrong. A decade passed, bringing absolute polarization to our separate worlds. While the Sterling surname became nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in the dusty corridors of bankruptcy courts, I systematically conquered the corporate hierarchy on the East Coast. At 38, I occupied the chief financial officer suite of a major international conglomerate. My daily existence was governed by predictable fiscal quarters, aggressive boardroom negotiations, and an environment of absolute control. I had meticulously insulated myself behind a towering fortress of wealth and professional respectability, operating under the assumption that the wreckage of my bloodline was a permanently sealed file. The reality for my former relatives was a brutally stark contrast. The unforgiving machinery of a federal Chapter 7 liquidation had stripped them of every single luxurious asset they once flaunted. Richard and Evelyn were forced into a crumbling, rent-controlled apartment complex on the bleak industrial outskirts of their county. Their immaculate credit scores were replaced by a devastating financial blacklist, rendering them entirely unable to lease a vehicle or secure even a fundamental business loan. Linda, violently stripped of her wealthy fiancé, and her lifelong delusions of grandeur, was trapped in the exact same cycle of poverty. She spent her days working grueling retail shifts merely to subsidize our parents' meager survival. I truly believed the federal agencies had finished dismantling them years ago. However, the American justice system possesses a remarkably long and unyielding memory. The initial asset forfeitures and civil penalties were only the beginning. The Department of Justice was now elevating the stakes, aiming to make a highly publicized example out of their corporate tax evasion to deter other local enterprises. A senior federal prosecutor contacted my corporate legal counsel with a formal, non-negotiable subpoena. The government was officially moving forward with severe criminal indictments against Richard, charging him with multiple counts of felony wire fraud and conspiracy. The federal case was meticulously constructed, yet the prosecution team faced a critical vulnerability. Richard's aggressive defense attorneys were attempting to suppress the initial encrypted ledger I had surrendered, citing complex chain-of-custody technicalities. To overcome this legal hurdle and guarantee a conviction, the prosecutors desperately needed my direct sworn testimony. Because I was the original target of their identity theft, and the auditor who initially cracked the shadow accounts, my presence on the witness stand was the absolute linchpin required to send my father to a federal penitentiary for the remainder of his natural life. I sat alone at my expansive mahogany desk, staring blankly at the official government documents demanding my presence in court. For the first time in my illustrious career, the legal clauses did not offer a clear, emotionless solution. The profound moral weight of the decision pressed heavily against my chest. Signing the cooperation agreement meant actively pushing an aging, broken man into a concrete cell. Refusing to testify, however, could potentially allow a lifelong manipulator to exploit a legal loophole and escape true accountability once again. The agonizing internal debate consumed my entire afternoon. Just as I finally reached for my desk phone to instruct my legal team on how to respond to the Department of Justice, the private intercom on my console chimed abruptly. My executive assistant's voice filtered through the speaker, carrying a highly unusual tone of distressed urgency. She informed me that a group of erratic, disheveled individuals had somehow bypassed the lower security checkpoints and were currently causing a massive disruption in the main executive lobby, frantically demanding an immediate audience with me. The disruptive commotion echoing from the ground floor reception lobby violently severed my train of thought. Instead of allowing my executive assistant to summon local law enforcement, I authorized my security detail to escort the frantic trespassers into an isolated, soundproof conference room adjacent to the executive elevators. When I pushed through those heavy glass doors, the visual contrast was jarring. The towering, intimidating figures of my childhood had been brutally reduced to hollow, shivering shells. Richard's once impeccable posture had collapsed into a permanent slump, his cheap, ill-fitting clothes hanging loosely off an emaciated frame. Evelyn looked aged decades beyond her actual years, her manicured elegance entirely replaced by deep, exhausted wrinkles and panicked eyes. Linda stood rigidly in the corner, clutching a scuffed imitation leather handbag radiating a defensive, nervous energy. They did not invade my corporate sanctuary to beg for a financial handout. They came solely to beg for their freedom. Richard, the arrogant patriarch who used to command entire country clubs, physically dropped to his knees on the polished marble floor. His voice cracked pitifully as he pleaded with me to ignore the federal subpoena, to claim profound memory loss on the witness stand, to execute whatever legal maneuvering was necessary to keep him out of a federal penitentiary cell. Witnessing the absolute humiliating devastation etched into their faces, a brief, treacherous wave of human pity washed over me. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I genuinely considered instructing my attorneys to stonewall the prosecutors and let this broken, aging man spend his final years in peace. Then the fragile illusion shattered. In the tense, suffocating silence of the room, Linda leaned closer to Evelyn, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper she mistakenly assumed I could not hear. If she hadn't gone crying to the cops in the first place, our family wouldn't be in this miserable state. Evelyn immediately patted her younger daughter's arm in a gesture of maternal solidarity, glaring up at me with a flash of deeply familiar resentment. Your father only made a slight administrative miscalculation, Nina. You never had to destroy our entire lives over a simple mistake. The momentary empathy I felt instantly evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, freezing clarity. A grueling decade of severe poverty and social exile had taught them absolutely nothing about personal accountability. They were still aggressively playing the victims, still completely willfully blind to the destructive reality of their own felony crimes. The realization permanently cemented my resolve. I was not dealing with a remorseful family seeking genuine redemption. I was dealing with cornered fraudsters seeking a convenient loophole. "Stand up," I commanded, my tone completely devoid of any familial warmth. Richard slowly scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against a leather chair. "I will not commit perjury, nor will I defy a federal mandate," I stated, walking over to the head of the conference table. "However, my legal counsel has meticulously drafted a highly specific non-cooperation affidavit. If I sign and submit it to the Department of Justice, aggressively challenging the admissibility of the digital evidence I originally acquired, the prosecution's entire chain of custody collapses. The government will lose their primary witness, and the federal indictment will likely be dismissed." Their eyes widened with a desperate, hungry glimmer of hope. "But I am not offering you a free pass," I continued, cutting off their premature relief. I reached into my leather portfolio, extracted a thick, legally binding civil settlement, and dropped it squarely onto the center of the mahogany table, waiting for their final decision. Richard's trembling hands hovered over the polished mahogany table, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the bold legal print that detailed his ultimate defeat. The non-prosecution and disclosure agreement drafted by my corporate attorneys did not demand a single cent of financial restitution. Instead, it demanded something far more agonizing for a narcissist: the absolute, unvarnished truth. The strict clauses explicitly required Richard and Evelyn to sign a sworn public confession. By affixing their signatures, they would legally admit to orchestrating the multi-year corporate tax fraud, confess to the malicious identity theft involving my social security number, and fully accept sole criminal liability. This document would be handed directly to the federal prosecutors. It was a calculated plea maneuver, surrendering their fake dignity to secure a recommended minimum security sentence, rather than risking a devastating trial that would guarantee them maximum time in a federal penitentiary. Evelyn quietly wept, no longer producing theatrical sobs for an audience, but shedding genuine tears for the permanent death of her high society illusion. Linda stared blankly at the floor, finally comprehending that there was no magical bailout, no hidden trust fund to rescue her. Richard's jaw clenched. The oppressive silence in the conference room was deafening. Cornered by the inescapable reality of his own actions, he slowly picked up the heavy brass pen. With a defeated, agonizing exhale, he scrawled his signature across the dotted line, legally binding himself to the consequences he had spent a decade running from. Evelyn followed her hand, shaking so violently she could barely form the letters. I reached across the table and smoothly retrieved the executed contract. Slipping the document into my leather portfolio, I felt an extraordinary, weightless sensation wash over my chest. I looked directly into the eyes of the people who had biologically created me. There was no burning hatred left in my veins, no lingering desire for revenge, and certainly no sadness. There was only the profound serenity of a meticulously balanced ledger. "The outstanding debt between us has been settled in full," I stated, my voice echoing with quiet, unshakable authority. 10 years ago, you stood in a crowded restaurant and declared that this family only had one daughter. You were absolutely right. That daughter is Linda. From this exact second forward, I do not exist to you, and you do not exist to me. We are entirely finished. I did not wait for a response, nor did I offer a comforting goodbye. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room. I pressed the call button for the private executive elevator. As I stepped inside, the polished steel doors glided shut seamlessly, cutting off the sight of their broken figures and permanently locking away the trauma of my past. As the elevator descended toward the bustling city streets, I stepped out into the brilliant afternoon sunlight. I hadn't just won a legal war, I had reclaimed my total independence. The emotional ledger of my life was finally irreversibly balanced. The final takeaway lessons from the ledger. If you have watched this journey until the very end, I want to leave you with a crucial perspective. Society constantly dictates that blood is thicker than water, implying that family ties require endless, unconditional forgiveness. But this story proves that shared DNA is never a valid license for financial abuse, psychological manipulation, or identity theft. Sometimes the most empowering form of forgiveness is not reconciliation. It is simply closing the toxic account and walking away. True justice isn't always about aggressively destroying those who hurt you. It's about holding them strictly accountable while preserving your own peace. You do not owe your future to the people who actively tried to sabotage it. Many viewers might argue that Nina was too cold and calculating, while others will say she delivered the exact masterpiece of legal justice her parents deserved. What is your personal stance? Did she handle this federal ultimatum correctly, or would you have chosen a different path? Share your perspective in the comments below, because setting firm boundaries is a conversation we all need to have.
Thank you for listening to Revenge Mode. May this story remind us what your family really means.